Glad to see you. We'll just jump right in, especially since people were sort of in different spots. I know different things were happening. Wanted to see if there was anything really from last time. Just a quick reminder, we did chapter 6 last week. We talked about where Paul really shifts from the Adam, the recapitulation model of chapter 5, where Adam, it was the sinner and Christ was the one who redeems us. The sort of that idea of recapitulation model into we die with Christ in baptism and rise again with him. And it all came down to this idea that sin is a force, right? There's this idea that it's not just I have sinned, it is that sin is also that sort of whole personification of evil and temptation that all gets wrapped together. And Paul uses that slave metaphor. It says we have to serve one. You can't serve two masters. You have to choose which master you're going to serve. And then additionally, we talked a little bit about how that was done, at least in Paul's view, communally, that this was something that the community did together, was to serve Christ or to serve sin, either way. All right, so I know people weren't all in the same spot for that. Do we have any commentary? Do we want to go back and revisit that, or are we going to let sleeping dogs lie? Okay, we'll just jump right in. So Paul continues his argument here in chapter 7. Do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person only during that person's lifetime? Thus, a married woman is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is discharged from the law concerning the husband. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law. And if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. In the same way, my friends, you have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. While we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are discharged from the law, dead to that which held us captive, so that we are slaves not under the old written code, but in the new life of the Spirit. So this is really, Paul used that slave metaphor to conclude chapter 6. Again, when Paul wrote the letter, he did not prescribe chapters. It was one long story, one long letter. So I do think it's fair to say that while we have divided them up to help us be able to find chapter and verse, Paul absolutely is linking that slave metaphor now to the marriage metaphor. He's using two different examples to try and explain how sin and Christ are different, and we have to serve or be connected to one versus the other, right? This makes a lot of folks uncomfortable. When I say uncomfortable, I read 3 different commentators and all spent lots of ink trying to explain or justify Paul's marriage metaphor analogy. Made everybody uncomfortable, that idea of using that. They could, I don't know why, but they were okay with the slave metaphor, but the marriage metaphor made people uncomfortable. Part of it is the word used is hypandros. It went backwards. Hold on. Decided to go on ahead of me. The word is hypandros, which literally means subject to man or under man. And I think part of maybe some of people's discomfort is the fact that marriage laws are very patriarchal in the first century. They were very much, the woman had to depend on her husband for everything. And so maybe that's part of why people were not comfortable with that metaphor. I'm not positive. It was just interesting that they really bucked. So I could go through all their explanations. I don't know that it's all helpful. That is, Personally, I think Paul is just trying to give an imperfect example that shouldn't be pressed for too many details. I think that's where people were getting, the commentators and scholars were getting a little bogged down. I think it's really, we're just supposed to hear the very superficial view that a married woman can't date. She can't have two husbands, right? She can't have two men in her life. But a widow can date and marry a new man, right? So, in the same way that the means by which the woman is allowed to have another husband is if the first husband is dead. Paul then says, well, then you have died in Christ, so you can be risen with Christ. You no longer are married to sin, you're married to Jesus. I honestly just see it as that straightforward a metaphor. But like I said, people get anxious about that. So again, the clear idea is just while widowed, marriage law is no longer to the woman, right? The harder part is where we transition next. That is, we're no longer subject to the law because Christ died. And I think this is where a lot of the scholars don't always necessarily have a problem with the marriage metaphor as much as they have a problem with, wait, is Paul saying that the law is sin? It sure sounds like it. It sure sounds like he is talking about how sin or how the law leads to sin. And that creates all sorts of questions about why did God give us the law? Then why did God ask us to follow the law? If God knew we couldn't follow the law and all it did was create more sin, why on earth would he introduce it in the first place, right? What do y'all think? I mean, this, on one level, I think it's sort of straightforward, but on another level, when you start digging into Paul's argument, it does have some problematic conversation points.
Hey, Bill, this is sort of a basic question, but when he's referring to the law here, and we're no longer subject to it since Christ died, is he talking about the religious rules and laws?
Yeah, he's talking about the laws of Moses for sure. Definitely the 813 laws of Moses. Or 613. I always say 8. I don't know why. It's 613.
Well, isn't the point sort of that under the law, you keep score, and you're subject to, however, whatever the consequences of the law are. But so if that's what you're living under, then that's what you live by. But Christ has come along, and in essence, you were slave to the law, but now Christ has redeemed you. Christ has paid the price and basically bought you out of your enslavement to the law, and now you're enslaved to Christ. I mean, it's kind of like chutes and ladders. I mean, you can be going along from one level to the next and trudging, and then all of a sudden, you get the ladder and you you climb 6 flights, and you left all the law behind.
Right. I think that's, again, part of this is it's just an imperfect metaphor, to be sure, but at the same time, I don't find it to be that difficult an idea to say that there is a new option and a new way. But the big part that's hard is, but wait, what? And this is what Christians have been doing for the 2,000 years we've been in existence, right? We all do the same thing. We say, okay, we don't have to follow the laws of Moses, those 613 rules. Oh, but we do like those 10 commandments. Those are pretty good. We should stick with the 10 commandments, right? Oh, well, maybe don't forget, we also need to follow some of these other ones on the side over here. These are pretty good ones too, about staying faithful to your marriage, right? And so we end up picking and choosing which of those 613 rules we want to follow. And it gets very litigious, I think, is the way to actually talk about it even. I mean, it gets very selective at the least.
But doesn't Jesus simplify the law simply by saying, in essence, there's really only 2? that all 613 laws really come down to loving God with all your heart and soul and loving your neighbor as yourself.
Sure. Sure.
I mean, I think Jesus in essence is, I understand it. Okay. I want to say it. You're not subject to the individual laws, but they really are all encapsulated in those two, if you think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Makes perfect sense to me. Sure. Sure.
Can you imagine the scorecard on all those 613 laws they would have to keep on each person?
Well, I mean, the funny thing is, like, a lot of those rules, they don't all apply to every person. So there are some ins and outs there. I think the challenge that we have is just, again, that sort of broader idea of like, well, okay, Paul, we're free from the law and now we're subject to the Spirit, but there's still ways that we're supposed to live our life. Paul certainly has that idea. Certain rules that should and shouldn't apply, which are which, right? That we still end up, everybody ends up in that sort of moral quandary at some point going like, well, do not kill, right? Does that mean, but I can kill in protection of my family? I mean, there's all those sort of classic ethical questions that start to play out very, very quickly that are not always easy to reduce to a simple kind of yes, no, or even to this is the rule kind of situation too, right? I mean, all of this gets much more complex.
I mean, it kind of reminds me of, I think if I can do this, is Richard Rohr draws this analysis and talks about this sort of the old way of looking at it, or the pre-Jesus way was you have sin, and if you can seek to be forgiven, at least if I maybe getting it wrong.
That's okay. Give it a shot.
I mean, you have sin, and you repent, and then you've repented and you seek forgiveness, and then you are transformed. But the Jesus model is, and this is kind of what Paul is talking about, you sin, but you're forgiven. Right. And the forgiveness leads to transformation, which then leads to new life.
Sure. Yeah, I think, that's sort of the positive, which I do think is the argument that Paul is trying to make, that we are released and we are freed from sin, more than worrying about the specifics of sin.
Well, where's the line drawn? Because you have the law, and the law, is no longer subject, and you believe in Jesus and you try, but you're still human. You're still going to sin. So where's the line?
Well, that's the whole rest of this chapter. We'll keep looking at that. He's not done just here. He's not done just here. We'll keep pushing on though. So again, Paul is very clear. The next line literally is that he does not reject the law as sin. That is, he is not saying that, but he definitely has an idea that we are now in a new system with the Spirit of God. There is this idea. So Paul's argument is the same here, I think, on some level. Will you serve sin or will you serve Jesus? That seems to certainly be the continuation of his argument. You have to choose who you'll serve, who you obey, who you'll live or die with. I ended up with an old page there. That's what happened. Anyway, so we'll just keep pushing on into this. That is, what then should we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was Once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me and through it killed me. The law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. Did what is good then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin working death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin. Through the commandment might become you sinful beyond measure. All right, so Paul clarifies his argument. The law is not sin. The law is good. The commandment is good and sacred and holy. It comes from God. It is not sin. Sin, though, uses the law to tempt us into bad behavior. I think we can agree that's Paul's argument. I don't think there's a whole lot more complexity to it than that. He sort of circles it and tells us these things in a variety of ways, but I think we can all agree that that's the basics of what Paul is saying. And I think it may be a little bit of an oversimplification, but it sure seems that Paul is saying the law is good, defines sin, and then once that sin is defined, then sin can use it to tempt us to terrible actions and behavior. It's almost somewhat circular, right? As he says, I didn't know what coveting was until he said, do not covet. Then I found out what coveting was. Anyway, so scholars even go so far as to argue, and I never would have argued or thought of this in 100 years, but in chapter 7, there is this question of who is the I? That is, I saw these things and I was tempted and I didn't know this. And the question is, who is the I in chapter 7? Okay. I would assume, personally, I would say that the I is Paul, but most scholars seem to think that that's not the case, that this is more of a rhetorical device for Paul to set up either a straw man or the consensus is that I is either Adam or Israel. As we've been talking previously about how Adam is sinful. So Adam would not have known not to do something until God said, do not eat the fruit. Israel would not have known not to worship the golden calf until God said, do not commit adultery. So either way, the argument, or some of the arguments are that it's either Adam or Israel is that I who is fallen and is now redeemed in Jesus Christ.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm going to, is redemption in Jesus Christ or is redemption through Jesus Christ?
Yes. I would argue through the way we use the terminology, but
Right.
in the Greek, you do not say I believe just simply in Jesus. You put your faith into Jesus. There's some different terminology that's used in the Greek there. So it might be somewhat of a Greek kind of issue that sometimes it's using that word into or in interchangeably. I'd have to go back and look. But through Jesus Christ probably makes more sense, at least to me.
It does to me.
So N.T. Wright, both Bishop Wright and Kathy Grieb, two of the books that I've been using on this, agree that, or argue that the I is Israel using Genesis 32 as a text. If you don't remember that one, that is, we all know about the fall of Adam and therefore humanity, but because Paul used it previously, right? But Kathy Grieb and N.T. Wright argue that Genesis 32 is that moment with the golden calf where Israel worships an idol and brings death and judgment on themselves. Evidently, in Israel in the first century, for Jews in the first century, they understood that the fall of Adam and of humanity, of course, happened in Genesis, but then the fall of Israel really happens in that moment with the golden calf. That's where Israel fails as a nation, that they collectively commit sin by worshiping the golden calf at that moment. Therefore, they had this idea that Israel had fallen there and needed to be redeemed as So either way, the argument is that in both cases, the eye did not have, they didn't have a law to rebel against. That is, it wasn't until Adam was told not to eat the fruit that he realized and was tempted to eat the fruit, right? That sin came into the world as the law was shared. The same way with the golden calf, that Moses was bringing the tablets down the mountain to give them the law so that they would know not to do things. I don't know that that holds up perfectly, but what do you all think of these explanations for who is the eye, or just the idea of sin and its relationship to the law?
Well, what occurs to me is, and I think I read this, that in some of the other nations, in the Middle East around the time the law code was being developed in Israel, that yes, they had other codes, for example, Hammurabi's, but that, in certain respects, the law of Israel was more refined, I think, particularly as it pertained to relations among people. And so, I can understand that there can be legal systems where, actions are not illegal, but that may be under the Jewish law. And so, if you were in one of these societies and you took the actions which were not illegal, then you wouldn't have broken the law. But it's a more refined system with the Jews, and so there's a law there and you broke it. I can get that kind of point.
Yeah, that does make sense. And we have to name that in the first century, as much the same now, quite frankly, when Jews have been in exile, when they have not been as a nation in Israel, which they are not in the first century, of course, they're dominated by Rome. The law becomes a marker that this is how we're different from the other nations, right? We have these rules. This is a mark of who we are in our relationship with God as well. So it has that deeper identity context too. All right, so for both the marriage metaphor and Paul's conversation about the law as separate from sin, I would say the same thing. Sometimes preachers and teachers, myself included, have great illustrations and explanations, and sometimes we don't. I think Paul can absolutely, like anyone else, have a great and perfect way to explain something, and then other times he pushes it or stretches it or doesn't quite always fit. I'm not saying that that's the case here. You may love both of these metaphors and the way Paul's using it, but this is true. Really, this is sort of a meta conversation about all of Paul's works, or anywhere in the New Testament, right? There are things that we just have to look at and say, well, does that explanation, does that description, does that rule, does that recommendation make perfect sense or not? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We can say we don't like it, and that doesn't mean we have to throw out every single argument Paul makes in Romans, right? This is just a broad thing to name. We can say, I really don't like him using slave metaphors or talking about how married women have to obey their husbands. And we can have that critique and say that we disagree with Paul on that, and then say, but he's got some great points about serving Christ versus serving sin, right? So we can disagree with a statement of Paul and then still hold to the totality of the argument. And be people of faith. That doesn't mean we're unfaithful. It doesn't mean we are unchristian or anything else. It's just to say that there are times when we read the text and we can say, yeah, this works. And again, I'm not saying we dismiss the law. I believe and have preached that the law of Moses is like any relationship with someone we love, right? That's how I've had conversations with faithful Jews now. And how I also understand it, that is, if you're in a relationship with someone and they say, I hate carrots, then you don't serve them carrots, right? I mean, to be super simplistic. And in many ways, the law of Moses is God's instructions for how can we live a better life with each other and a better life with God. And I imagine most of us agree, if you don't lie, cheat, and steal, you're probably going to have a little bit easier time than if you do lie, cheat, and steal constantly, right? That you're going to be in better relationship with all around the people around you. So you make the choices because you care about God, about what that relationship is. And just like any relationships, there are days when we make each other happy, days when we fail and don't quite get it right. So I agree with Paul that sin is a larger, more insidious force in the world. I'm just not as sure as Paul that without law, sin is dead. That way he describes it, right? So somehow, if I didn't know that this was bad, then there wouldn't be any sin in the world. Or sin would be in some way. I'm not positive I buy that.
Yeah, I like your Bob Dylan argument better.
Yeah, you had to serve somebody, right? Yeah. Yep. But yeah, I mean, is there anything else we want to talk about that? We'll continue. Paul continues his argument here with sin and pushes it even a little bit farther. But what do we think so far?
It's interesting to me that he doesn't fall back on Jesus's words of boiling it down to loving God and loving your neighbor. He's going the opposite direction almost. He's making it so complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is. He is.
Bill,
Of course, he's writing before the Gospels.
That is true. He's writing before the Gospels.
That's right. That's right.
Bill,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
in terms of the law, is that something that was, I know the law of Moses, but 613 laws, did he sit down and develop 613 laws, or was this developed over time with a lot of different people involved and over years? Because there's a general term, the law, but that covers a lot of laws and I guess a lot of time, huh?
I think, yes, I think we'd probably be safe to say that the law of Moses are the rules that were given on Sinai that are very explicit. Not just the 10 Commandments. There's lots of other rules that Moses goes up on the mountain and gets all sorts of different rules about eating kosher, about all these different ways of ordering your life. They're all in there. I think I'm 99% sure that most biblical scholars would agree that it's much more like the British Constitution. There's not one central document. It's a whole collection of rules that happened over a period of time, right? That the law of Moses all got lumped in to say, oh, this is all the code from Moses, but there are rules, and they're all written down there in Leviticus, Exodus, and Deuteronomy. Those are where all the rules come from. But it's also pretty clear that those are all written in some different time periods. So it's most likely this was the ethical code when we talk about the law of Moses and the law of Israel kind of ideas, that they all probably developed over several hundred years, more than just a one night occurrence where God gave him all the rules in a book.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
So in a timeline, what are we talking about as to when these rules were all written down?
1500 BC, give or take. But again, most scholars think that like Exodus and Leviticus were written more around the time of the Exodus from Egypt, which would be theoretically 1500 or so. Then David, Solomon, and you have all of those kings and all those kinds of things that are going on that likely added to the rules. And even more, Deuteronomy was found during, I can't remember which king. There's a king of
King Josiah.
I think, yes, King Josiah finds the book of Deuteronomy, magically finds this book with all these wonderful rules and reminders. That is about 500 years later, almost 1,000 years later. And you go, oh, okay. So somewhere in that between 1500 BC and 500 BC, give or take, because the exile's at 587 or something like that, BC something. So it's somewhere in that time frame that all those sort of in different ways and different editions that we can't quite crack the code on were added and collected. And then, as any rabbi will tell you, there are entire books written by rabbis to try and explain what the laws mean and how to live with those laws, which is really gets into that ethical conversation, right? Like, thou shalt not murder. Well, is the nation of Israel justified, though, in shooting invaders who come in? Or was God talking about war? Because God certainly orders Israel at different points to go to war with its neighbors. Those kinds of things all become part of the additional framework of Israel. And so it's the same way with any country's jurisprudence, right? You have the laws that are passed or either written by the king or written by Congress and approved, and then you have the interpretations of those laws and how do they actually get used by the judiciary and by lawyers, and how do they work in practice. All of that gets combined into a very complex conversation. So certainly if you ask a good Jew about the laws of Moses, they could tell you there's 613, but they would also tell you that you need to go and refer to, and I'll get the book wrong. It's not the Mishnah. It's one of the, anyway, there's an entire book explanation.
Can the Talmud have a lot of interpretation?
The Talmud does have a lot of the interpretations. I'm not sure if that's where they all are, but anyway. But there's just interpretations on top of the rules that would also be considered the law as much as the law itself. And I do think when Paul is talking about the law here, he is talking not just about those 613 rules, but the interpretations and the the ethical guidelines and all the different ways that things have been laid on top of that. We've talked about that before, right? Where the law might say, do not covet your neighbor's wife. And then they say, well, okay, well, if that's the rule, you're not supposed to covet or desire your neighbor's wife, then what are ways that we can create a fence around that law? And that would be to say, oh, well, we should make sure then that the neighbor's wife wears more clothing and does not prove to be tempting. And then we should have maybe put up a wall so that you can't see your neighbor's wife. I mean, they have all these additional rules to try and say, how do we prevent ourselves from even being tempted or being put into a situation where you can't, which is why, if you go to an Orthodox community, they would say, like, how do you live into that? Well, then a man should never be alone in a room with a woman, period, so that there's no temptation to do anything. And that's not to say, oh, they're being prudish or terrible. They're just saying we know what happens next, so we're going to prevent ourselves from being tempted that way. So it's not officially the law, but it's considered part of the law because you're trying to live into it. Good conversation. It's interesting stuff. All right, so here's how Paul goes from here. Again, we can disagree with Paul. All right, here we go. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I do not understand my own actions. I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer, I've copied a lot of things extra here, sorry. That's the same. It is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self. But I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with my mind, I am a slave to the law of God, but with my flesh, I'm a slave to the law of sin. All right, so I think there's part of this argument we can all relate to, right? I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate, right? I think we can all say we've had those moments where we go, I know what I was supposed to do. I even knew in the moment what I was supposed to do, and somehow at what God would want me to do, everything else, but somehow in that moment, I ended up doing the very opposite of what I was, for a wide variety of reasons. And I think we can all fundamentally do that. There is, I think he's arguing that, clarifying his earlier argument around sin versus serving Christ. We all, even if we have our heart on the law or on Christ, both, man, sin just sneaks in and gets you, right? And again, this part I think we can all relate to and engage pretty easily because it's true for everybody. One of the most generous statements that I think Paul puts out in any of his letters. Sin and sinning continues even as we seek God. Yes, you have to choose who you're going to serve. The sort of Bob Dylan argument, right? You got to serve somebody, you got to serve God, or you got to serve sin. But even when you try to serve God, whew, it's hard, and he's ended up slipping right back into all kinds of bad action. He then declares that it is sin who makes him do it, almost. Sin that takes his good intentions and thwarts them. And so again, I'm 100% on board with Paul in saying that I mess up and my best intentions are set aside by temptations and sin, that I do the best I can, but then go sideways. I'm not as sure that I can lob all of my errors on sin as I think sometimes I just make a stupid choice. Paul puts this in such a way that there's almost no personal action, which I know that was something, Stefan, as we were talking last time, that you were wrestling with, that Paul does not seem real high on personal accountability. You know if that's it, but certainly the will is not a conversation point in his argument right now. It's either you're for sin or you're for God, and yeah, I don't know. For me, this is a sticking point with Paul.
And also for me, but that's okay. I mean, it's almost like Paul is saying, don't be human.
Well, one thing.
Go ahead, Len.
So one thing Richard Rohr says on this, which makes a ton of sense to me, is that when Paul says flesh, think the ego, think false self. And yeah, that this is about if what we're doing is our true inner self, the one that's known to God, the one that God knows from creation and loves, and that's what we want, to be in touch with God. And if we're that's one thing. And then we've got the false self, which has been constructed sort of in reaction to the world and the corruption of the world. And so that's when we are letting that drive that piece of us, that false self, drive our actions, then we get into to separating ourselves from God, the sin. If we focus on the true to God self, and that, sort of, and think about how we make the journey with God, with our true original self, that's how we're saved.
Okay. I certainly like the idea of using ego or that idea of the ego when you talk about the flesh, because I'm not always comfortable with the way he terms flesh. It almost sounds Gnostic, quite frankly. There's almost like, oh, the spirit's pure and the flesh is weak, and you go, oh, I don't like this at all. But if it's more ego, then that has a very different ring to it.
From Paul's perspective, is there forgiveness?
Oh, absolutely. Paul's very clear. I mean, in all of his ministry, that there is forgiveness. That's what, again, faith through Christ gives us grace and abounds, right? I mean, in abundance, that we don't have to worry about while we have sinned and we continue to sin. Great God continues constantly to reach out to us in grace and in love to redeem us. So I don't think that's any concern for Paul at all.
Bill, I have a question, and this
Yes,
might be
ma'am.
naive, but in talking about sin, like sin who makes him do it, when it's this discussion about sin, it's like sin is this living force that causes us to do wrong, rather than we as an individual do something wrong because of our will.
Right.
And it makes sin is this outside force acting on us rather than us making decisions and choices.
Yes, that's definitely how Paul's describing it. You're spot on. And I think on one level, it is easy also to understand in terms of, because we've all had those moments, right, where you go, I know what I'm supposed to do, but man, I still messed it all up. That it seems like there is another force involved that pulls us away to a degree that we don't always have as much control as we'd like to believe we do. I can buy that side of the argument. I just don't know that I can buy that it's 100% sin's fault and I never had a choice in the matter either. I don't know where that line is. That's the hard thing. I can't name with any theological or psychological certainty where that line is between being tempted to do something and where I chose to do something and where somebody almost pushed me into doing something. There's lots of gray there, right? That I don't know that I can name perfectly. Paul's trying to, and I appreciate, man, he's working hard. He's working hard to try and name it, but I don't know that I can say it with the certainty that he has in his mind of it.
I mean, it seems like though there's some consistency with some of the themes in the Gospels. I mean, I think about Mark, and Mark seems to have this notion of the forces of evil in the world, and that Jesus has come to take them on.
Right.
And we read the stories of the people who are possessed by demons. So to me, it's as if Paul is using sin in the way that other people might have said the devil or demons or whatever. But there's this inexplicable force in the world that makes people do bad things.
Right. No, I think that's exactly what Paul's saying. How do we buy it is the question, right? That's the question. Where do we fall on that idea? Which is where I can just name again. This is not necessarily what I'm saying right now is not what Paul's saying. I think exactly what you said, Lynn, that there is this personification and this force of evil in the world, whether we call him the devil or we call it just evil or sin, that is absolutely opposing the will of God, opposing what's good in our life. I don't know that I can buy 100% for me that and I don't think Paul would say that we're of that, that something we do something bad that we're absolved from it, but there's definitely there's just that question I have of like my responsibility in it.
Yeah, it's like one of the pastoral letters that says the love of money is the root of all evil.
Right. Yep. So Paul, I think, is wrestling with a huge topic here. fundamental question that he's asking. Why we have the law and all kinds of instructions and details, that hasn't worked. We still sin, even though we know thousands of different ways. And we could even say that the law of Moses and American law, we know all kinds of them. I'm not supposed to kill somebody. Man, people kill people anyway, right? I'm not supposed to steal, but people steal anyway. So why do we sin? And I think we could spend days and days talking on this topic. I can say unequivocally that Paul names the problem. And I am 100% sure that I agree with Paul that there are sort of this idea that there is that larger force. I just don't know that I can totally absolve myself at the same time from sin, from making choices sometimes, because Lord knows I have made some bad choices, done stupid things that God forgives me for, and I am grateful for that. I'll lean into that grace all day. But I'm not sure that I can just go, oh, it was sin's fault kind of model either for me. There's a little more personal accountability in that model that I need.
I mean, it kind of reminds me of in the Gospel of John, this notion of the world,
right?
Which when in the Message, Eugene Peterson always calls it the godless world. So I understand what it's meant, but I get the notion of this. Yes, there are temptations in the godless world, which are really speaking to the ego, and not to the true self. And if we allow our ego to respond to the godless world, then we find ourselves in the middle of sin.
Amen. Yeah. I will agree too that, I think there are, the other side of Paul's argument that I will definitely agree with, or there are times when I can say, you do have to choose. Am I going to try and follow Jesus here, even if I mess it up and don't do it perfectly? Am I following Jesus, or have I just given up and said, whatever, I'm going to do whatever I please kind of model, right? I'm going to follow sin or the godless world or my ego to whatever natural conclusion I want to take it to. And I do think that side of Paul's argument, I do think is legitimate. There are definitely times where we can say, yeah, I wasn't doing at all what I was supposed to do. I was serving the wrong master for that season. I am positive, regardless of how we argue it, that God wants us to do more, which I guess is maybe just what I always wrestle with in all of theology. As wonderful it is to be redeemed, I always have this idea that loved, I always have this idea that God wants us to we've been forgiven, so what are we going to do now? How do we start to live into that grace? Not that we can earn it, we can't ever earn it, but there is a natural response of gratitude and of helping others in that process if we can. Paul's not getting into that argument. I am. So next week, and we can talk what we want. Next week we get into chapter 8. Paul answers some more of these big questions and starts to shift a little bit more away from the really hard stuff. This is really, chapter 7 is probably the most difficult part of Romans, because it does get into these deep conversations about sin and how we understand sin and death and how we understand life and forgiveness. These are not easy ones. So chapter 8 continues a little bit, but starts to come out so that Paul can have some other conversations about the church. Well, again, we'll just be on next week on the 28th. Anything else we want to look at, share? You answered it all. We've got sin figured out, huh? Yep.
Yeah, we do.
Well, good to be with you, my friends. Y'all have a great day, and we'll see y'all soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye.
Bye, y'all. Take care.
Well, bye, everyone.